Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Mershon Center for International Security Studies. My name is Joe Steeb. I'm a postdoc here at Mershon. I work with the U.S. Foreign and Military Policy Research Team with Pete Mansour and Rick Herman. Today, we're happy to host a discussion group with Professor Peter Hahn of The Ohio State University of our Department of History. Professor Hahn is an expert on U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East and the author of 7 books in that subject area, including Missions Accomplished, the United States and Iraq since World War I. I should note that there's a question mark on missions accomplished there. Professor Hahn will be examining the question, is the two-state solution dead? Specifically regarding the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, which flared up again earlier in 2021. Before I turn things over to Professor Hahn, I'd just like to discuss the format for this event. Professor Hahn will speak for about 20 minutes, and then I will moderate the discussion for the remaining time. If you would like to make a point or ask a question once Professor Hahn's finished, please use the little raise hand button, which is down at the bottom right-hand panel of your screen under reactions. Click reactions, and there's a little raise hand button. All right, that'll create a queue, and I'll manage the queue for questions and comments. Also, make sure that this is a meeting format. All right, so please make sure that you're muted if you're not speaking, just so we don't have background noise coming in from other people's backgrounds. We look forward to hearing from everyone or as many people as possible in this discussion. We particularly encourage grad students and undergraduates who may be in attendance to jump in with their thoughts and questions. And then also please keep in mind that this is definitely a very contentious issue and we expect everyone to maintain a respectful tone throughout the event. So I'm now going to hand things over to Professor Hahn, and thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you, Joe, for that introduction, and thanks to everyone in attendance this afternoon for your interest in what is certainly a timely and highly contended issue. A prospective two-state solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict has clearly fallen on hard times. The major focus of peace diplomacy in the 1990s, TSS, has experienced considerable turbulence since the Camp David summit of 2000. The last moment when it offered promise. Today, Israeli-Palestinian relations have become so hostile and the necessary prerequisites for peacemaking so depleted that it's tempting to declare the TSS impossible to achieve. A review of the historical record reveals, however, that the principle of TSS has gone through cycles of viability and once before was considered dead, only to come back to life. TSS originated more than a century ago, not long after European Jews began migrating to Ottoman Palestine. In the Balfour Declaration of 1917, for example, Britain pledged support for the establishment of, quote, a Jewish national home in Palestine, while also stipulating that, quote, nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine. In 1937, the Royal Commission of Inquiry, also known as the Peel Commission, recommended partition of mandatory Palestine into 2 states as the best way to pacify the Palestinian Jewish violence that had beset the land. The government in London did not formally embrace this plan, and in fact backed away from it in the Emergency White Paper of 1939, before the impact of World War II forced Britain to cede responsibility for the future of the mandate to the United Nations in 1947. The UN's Special Committee on Palestine, or UNSCOP, recommended partition of the territory into 2 states. The General Assembly voted approval of partition in 1947, thus enacting a 2-state solution. But only 1 state emerged. The Jewish community in Palestine accepted partition and promptly organized the State of Israel. The Palestinian community resisted partition, declined to organize a government, and allied with 5 Arab states in trying, quote, to drive the Jews into the sea. When the international hostilities ended in early 1949, the State of Israel had survived and expanded, and the remnants of the envisioned State of Palestine were occupied by Egypt, Jordan, and Syria. Having crashed so ingloriously on the UN launchpad, TSS remained dormant for a quarter century. The Palestinian people were generally dispossessed. Some became citizens of Israel, while most became political refugees, exiled to the occupied territories or foreign countries. In the Arab-Israeli War of 1967, Israel occupied the remnants of Palestine previously controlled by Egypt, Jordan, and Syria, establishing authority over Palestinians residing there. Some Palestinians organized violent resistance to Israel, mostly through the PLO, which was founded in 1964. Resistance took the form of assaults on Israeli assets within Israel, within the occupied territories, or even in other countries. At the conclusion of the 1967 and 1973 Arab-Israeli wars, the UN Security Council passed resolutions 242 and 338, respectively, calling for Israeli withdrawal from occupied territories and for the restoration of peace among every state in the area. Nothing was said about Palestinians except a call for a just settlement of the refugee problem. The TSS remained dormant. TSS did reemerge, however, in the late 1970s. Determined to achieve Arab-Israeli peace, President Jimmy Carter favored a settlement based on Israeli withdrawal from the occupied territories and indicated that if the PLO would accept UN 242 and renounce violence, he would work toward a Palestinian state. The Camp David Accords of 1978 included a framework for the conclusion of a peace treaty between Egypt and Israel, which led to such a treaty within a year. It also included the so-called Framework for Peace in the Middle East, which sketched a 3-year plan for a transition of the West Bank and Gaza from occupied territories to self-governing districts under Palestinian autonomy with Israeli security guaranteed. But that second framework ran into considerable opposition from Israel, from other Arab states, and from the PLO. The UN rejected it because it had been negotiated without consultation with Palestinian representatives. After a decade of pause, TSS gained traction again in the late 1980s. Galvanized by the first intifada to promote peace before extremism took root, Secretary of State George Shultz offered in 1988 to arbitrate negotiations between Israel and a joint Jordanian PLO delegation, aiming to reach a final agreement on the occupied territories. 5 months later, PLO leader Yasser Arafat addressed the United Nations, called for a peace conference between Israel, Palestinians, and Arab states, renounced terrorism, and pledged, quote, to live in peace with Israel. The Madrid Conference of October 1991 marked the first formal meeting between Israeli and Palestinian representatives and led to a series of discrete follow-up meetings in Oslo. In the September 1993 Declaration of Principles, signed by Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin and Yasser Arafat under President Clinton's beaming gaze, Israel and the PLO agreed to launch a 5-year transition in which Israel would withdraw from the Gaza Strip and Jericho area. Palestinians would democratically elect an interim government over those territories, and negotiations would ensue, leading to a final peace treaty. TSS soon reached its pinnacle. In July 1994, Arafat established the Palestine Authority, which fielded a police force, printed postage stamps, issued travel documents, and otherwise acted like a state. In October 95, Israel and the PA signed the interim agreement on the West Bank and Gaza, alternatively known as the Taba or Oslo II Accord, which provided for the withdrawal of the IDF from 9 major Palestinian towns. The State Department hosted a conference at which 46 countries pledged $2.5 billion in economic aid for the Palestinians. In January 1996, Palestinian voters elected Arafat as president and elected an 88-member legislature. On April 24th, the Palestinian National Council overwhelmingly voted to amend its charter to excise those passages that called for the violent destruction of Israel. A day later, Israel's Labor Party declared that it no longer opposed Palestinian statehood. Even during this heyday of TSS diplomacy, however, the seeds of its decline were planted. Extremists on both sides opposed the progress toward peace. Israeli Jewish gunmen murdered 29 worshipers at a mosque in Hebron in February 1994, and assassinated Prime Minister Rabin in November of 95. Hamas and Islamic Jihad sent suicide bombers onto Israeli buses beginning in 1994 and killed 59 Israelis in terrorist attacks following Arafat's election as president in early 1996. The political climate in Israel shifted, with voters electing the hawkish Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu in May 96. Netanyahu beefed up security and resumed settlement construction on the West Bank. Diplomats continued to advance TSS, but it stalled. At the Wye River Summit in 1998, Clinton persuaded Netanyahu and Arafat to pledge mutual concessions and to resume final status talks within a year. Secretary of State Madeleine Albright brokered the Sharm el-Sheikh Agreement of 1999 that set a target date for a final settlement of September 2000. Clinton welcomed Arafat and Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Barak to Camp David in July 2000 in hope of securing TSS before his own second term ended. Barak offered several concessions, including withdrawal from 90% of the West Bank, compensation for other lands, and a Palestinian capital in Jerusalem. But the talks broke down after Arafat insisted that Israel must withdraw to the 1967 borders, resettle refugees, and cede all of East Jerusalem. After 2000, various leaders continued to promote TSS even as its viability declined sharply. In 2002, the Arab League approved the Arab Peace Initiative, offering to establish normal relations with Israel after a Palestinian state was established. When launching his ill-fated Roadmap for Peace plan of 2002, George W. Bush declared, and I quote, "My vision is two states living side by side in peace and security." President Barack Obama tried in 2010 to jumpstart Israeli-Palestinian talks by inviting Netanyahu and PA Premier Mahmoud Abbas to the White House, but that effort was also for naught. The UN General Assembly passed Resolution 67/19 on November 29, 2012, giving the PA non-member observer status, calling on the Security Council to approve its formal membership in the UN, and endorsing TSS. Several factors militated against these efforts. The acute violence of the Second Intifada of 2000 to 2005 spoiled the mutual trust needed for peacemaking. Israeli politics became quite conservative. Ariel Sharon, prime minister in 2001 to 6, shut down the peace process while he suppressed the Intifada, and he erected a security wall around settlements in the West Bank. Netanyahu, who reoccupied the prime minister's office in 2009 until just recently, showed little enthusiasm for a Palestinian state and continued settlement construction and land acquisitions. The security wall and the Iron Dome air defense system provided robust security, reducing incentives to settle politically. The 2018 nation-state basic law declared Israel to be a Jewish state in which only the Jewish people would practice national self-determination, further confining its 1.8 million Palestinian citizens to second-class status. The law also declared Jewish settlement in the West Bank as, quote, a national value worthy of promotion and consolidation, which undermined the spirit of TSS. Palestinian politics also spoiled the prospects of TSS. Internal fighting resulted in the Palestine Authority governing the West Bank and Hamas controlling Gaza. When Hamas won the 2007 elections, President Abbas dissolved the parliament and began ruling by decree. Civil liberties waned while corruption and nepotism flourished. Hamas launched attacks on Israel under the mantle of defender of Palestinian rights. In April of 2021, Abbas canceled what would have been the first elections in the Palestinian territories in 15 years. Finally, President Donald Trump abandoned the relative even-handedness of preceding administrations and tilted clearly in favor of Israel. Trump moved the US Embassy to Jerusalem and closed the American consulate there that served the Palestinian community and was considered the prototype for an embassy to Palestine. He severed economic aid to the Palestinians. He recognized Israel's annexation of the Golan Heights, and he failed to protest Israel's construction of more than 9,000 homes in West Bank settlements. In February 2020, Trump proposed a peace plan that he called a win-win, but that largely favored Israel. While the proposal offered to establish a Palestinian state, its territorial and other terms clearly favored Israeli interests. While Netanyahu flanked Trump as he unveiled the plan, Abbas, who had not even been consulted in advance, strongly rejected the plan. In promoting the Abraham Accords, finally, Trump signaled that he favored normalization of Arab-Israeli diplomatic relations across the region, even in the absence of Palestinian gains towards statehood. At present, TSS still has advocates in high places. UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres declared in December 2020, and I quote, "The two-state solution remains the only path to ensuring that Palestinians and Israelis can both realize their legitimate aspirations, living side by side in peace and security based on the 1967 borders, and with Jerusalem as the capital of both states." President Joe Biden echoed this view in his address to the General Assembly just 2 days ago, declaring, and I quote, "I continue to believe that a two-state solution is the best way to ensure Israel's future as a Jewish democratic state, living in peace alongside a viable, sovereign, and democratic Palestinian state." Biden went on to acknowledge, and I quote, "We're a long way from that goal at this moment, but we should never allow ourselves to give up on the possibility of progress." Despite the support for TSS among international leaders, there are several reasons why it is not immediately viable. The momentum of developments of the last decade points in the wrong direction. Periodic violence, like the civil warfare that erupted last May, has bred insecurity, mistrust, and conservatism on both sides, and has galvanized extremists to take action to spoil any diplomatic progress. Israel has no compelling reasons to give in. As the region's superpower, it can rely on its security forces to protect its vital interests. Its domestic politics remain hostile to concessions. Israel's thriving economy makes it invulnerable to Arab economic boycotts, and the Abraham Accords indicate that diplomatic gains with other states no longer depend on a Palestine settlement. For their part, Palestinians have not demonstrated an ability to govern in a manner needed to make TSS work. The peace process resulted in inept or violent Palestinian leadership, seemingly incapable of engaging in meaningful diplomacy. Diehards insist on the absolute right of return, which likely is a deal breaker. And yet, despite these handicaps, the TSS seems to remain the best alternative. It is more realistic than the suggested one-state solution, under which Israelis and Palestinians would coexist within one national entity on equal grounds. Israeli leaders and people are unenthused about such a solution because they do not think the Palestinians are ready for democracy, and they absolutely do not want to sacrifice the Jewishness of their state. It's doubtful that Palestinians would be any more interested. Nor does it seem feasible to leave the problems unsolved for the long term. The status quo breeds violence and instability that risk a toxic blow-up. Israel's periodic military forays against extremists in Gaza, which some informally and crudely liken to mowing the lawn, cause widespread human suffering and undermine Israel's stature in much of the world. Israel might pursue its dominant position to the extreme, annexing the West Bank and engaging in a third wave of expulsions or ethnic cleansing. The longer Israel rules over Palestinians, the closer it gets to undermining its ideals of being a democracy and a light unto the nations. And the longer the Palestinians languish in political and economic conditions that breed extremism and violence. Because the Palestinians have never indicated passive acceptance of their condition, a third intifada, the eruption of guerrilla warfare, or even the use of WMD against Israel are possibilities that cannot be dismissed and might grow over time. In short, TSS remains the best option for both communities. Israelis would secure their vision of being both a Jewish and democratic state. Palestinians would gain self-determination. No other alternative would advance the interests of both sides. Finally, while the short-term prospects for TSS are slim, steps could be taken now to bolster its long-term chances. An effort could be made to transition Palestinian leadership to a new generation and to redirect Israeli thinking to embrace the advantages of TSS. The United States and other powers could create some facts on the ground, like sending envoys to prototype embassies in Ramallah or welcoming Palestinian representatives in their own capitals. And the United States could refrain from again vetoing a Security Council resolution recognizing Palestine. Both sides could be encouraged to engage in confidence-building joint activities, and creative minds could conceive of joint institutions that would reinforce democracy and cooperation across boundaries. Copious economic development could offer Palestinians peaceful routes forward. Israelis could be encouraged to view withdrawal from the West Bank as a step toward greater security, as the withdrawals from Egypt and Lebanon proved to be. The Arab signatories to the Abraham Accords and other states engaged with Israel could exert pressure on it to cooperate. Diplomats who promote TSS should acknowledge the deep difficulties it faces. External players can identify reasonable and balanced compromise terms to all the major issues. For instance, it's been noted that most Israeli settlements are close to the Green Line, and that 80% of settlers could be incorporated in Israel on the basis of a land swap of merely 4%. However fair such terms look on paper to external parties, however, it must be remembered that the protagonists have battle scars and deep-seated ideological and cultural commitments that militate against any concessions or even compromises. Empathy, trust, credibility, creative thinking, and time will be needed. Enshrined in the UN Partition Resolution of 1947, TSS soon after became moribund for a quarter century. Then it came back to the forefront of international diplomacy, and in the 1990s, it made significant progress toward realization before going dormant again. While the road forward to renewal of TSS is long and hard, it seems the most promising, or at least the least unpromising, solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Peter. Thanks for that interesting talk. So we're now going to turn over to audience questions. So if you have a question or a comment, please just use the raise hand function, indicate that you have a comment or question, and I will create a queue going forward. John, go ahead.
Thanks for the presentation. Would you talk a bit about the other Arab states who are starting to recognize Israel as part of the Abraham thing? That sort of seems to be, they're telling the Palestinians to get a life. You know, you lost a war 75 years ago, and we're just not going to keep messing around with this. A second question is, when you talk about time, do you realistically see any solution before the end of the millennium?
Two great questions. I indicated in my opening remarks that the Abraham Accords certainly encouraged Israel to the notion that it could achieve its interests in the broader Middle Eastern world, Arab Islamic world, even in the absence of a Palestinian state. Previously, the Arab League had enacted and enforced a consensus that no one would treat with Israel until there was a Palestinian state. Egypt, of course, violated that deal on a massive scale in 1979. Jordan made a peace treaty in 1994 that verged in the same direction. And now through the Abraham Accords, four powers have agreed to exchange ambassadors and negotiate trade deals with Israel, even though Palestine hasn't moved forward. my suggestion was that rewarded Israel, even though it had not accomplished the goal of a two-state solution. The message it sends the Palestinian people, really though, John, was the essence of your question. That's a little harder for me to decipher. And in fact, I'm open to your suggestions. Your question implied that it was a stick rather than a carrot that was wielded against the Palestinians, telling them to go get a life. If that were true, if that was their intent, or at least what they recognized as the likely consequence, I would caution them to calculate whether that effect is going to take place, whether that effect really will happen. Will the isolation implicit in the Abraham Accords rally the Palestinians to be more receptive to concession and compromise? I'm doubtful that it will. I think it will only make them more stubborn, even though that stubbornness is prone to leave them in the unfortunate situation that they're in. And then you had a second question also. Oh, the time frame. Yeah. I claim some expertise about the past. I claim much less about the future. I might go as far as to suggest that it took the TSS 25 years to come back the first time it went dormant. It's been not quite 25 years since it went dormant the second time. I'm not optimistic enough to believe that 5 more years will see it reemerge to the top of anyone's agenda or list of hopes and expectations. By the end of the millennium is too far out for me really to comment on with any specificity. If progress is going to be made, if TSS is going to be accomplished ever, we will be able to see, we'll have lots of time to measure markers of progress until we get there. So in 5 years, we'll know if we've made any progress, and then maybe we can project how long it might take. Right now, because we're at ground zero, it's really hard to know what type of time frame to anticipate going forward. But I think it's going to take time, probably measured in decades.
Measured in what?
Decades or half decade.
Okay. So you're optimistic it won't take centuries?
I didn't necessarily say I was optimistic that it won't take centuries. I said I said it's conceivable that it could happen in the 10 to 20 year time frame.
All right, thank you guys. Let's go to Joel Nitzkin.
What do you see as the role of Iran in the current Palestinian-Israeli conflict? And what do you see as the goal of Iran in intervening relative to the Palestinians?
I have a stronger feel for Iran's approach to Israel than I do to the Palestinians per se. I think that they view the Israelis as problematic for a lot of reasons, partly because of the historical legacy of becoming a non-Muslim state in the heart of the Muslim world, with growing authority over the third holiest site in Islam. And the way, from Iran's perspective, they have maltreated Arab Islamic communities within and surrounding their nation state. And then the militarism that they display in checking Iran's emergence as a possible nuclear power, all of that, of course, means there's certainly no love lost, and Iran struggles to find ways to contain Israeli influence. As a consequence of that, there's a natural affinity between Iran and the Palestinian community, and they probably are looking for opportunities to do what they can to enhance the interests of the Palestinian people. At the same time, they're probably also looking for opportunities to exploit the Palestinian people to bloody Israel.
Let me state the question a little bit differently. Iran hates Israel. does that mean that Iran is a friend of the Palestinians?
Well, you probably know the aphorism pertaining to the Middle East that the enemy of my enemy is my friend. And that is not universally applicable as a rule of thumb, but it's often applicable. And there probably is a degree of Iran sympathizing with the Palestinians because the Palestinians are an oppositional force to Israel.
Okay, thanks. Thanks, guys. We're going to move on to Stephen Millett.
Hi, Peter.
Hello, Steve. Long time no see.
Nice to see you again. And Jerry, very nice to see you again, too. I have a question that's parallel to Joel's, and that's the role of Saudi Arabia and shared hatred and suspicion of Iran. I'm wondering what you think about the two-state solution actually bringing the forces opposed to Iran together, and that the mutual hatred of so many elements for Iran might be a cohesive force.
Yeah, that's a possibility worth exploring. The Saudis did begin to display greater tolerance of Israel some time ago. U.S. officials worked hard on them all the way back in the Eisenhower administration. U.S. envoys in Saudi Arabia were trying to coach the Saudis to be what the Americans would consider a more senior, thoughtful statesman like country that didn't reflexively oppose anything to do with Israel, and to be an alternate voice of the Arab people in talking moderation and being willing to work with or at least tolerate Israel to a greater degree. In the 90s, as Jordan made peace and the US tried to negotiate a Syrian-Israeli peace treaty, Saudi Arabia and some of the other Gulf monarchies did begin to open up their economic relations with Israel. And recently, there has been some progress in promoting some type of accord or amity between Israel and Saudi Arabia in particular. That was part of Donald Trump's vision for a post-Palestine Middle East, if you will. Saudi Arabia, of course, is also highly concerned about Iran. And under that rule of thumb for Middle East diplomacy I just cited, it naturally would be looking at Israel as a potential partner on an anti-Iran axis. How we get from there to a Palestinian state, that's something I'll be honest with you, I'll have to think about a little bit more, how that dynamic might play out.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys. And by the way, just as you develop questions and comments, we have plenty of time left for those. So please go ahead and raise your hand using the raise hand function. Let's go to Brendan Strozk.
Hi. So if a two-state solution were enacted, what would happen to the 2+ million Palestinian refugees currently in Jordan?
That would have to be negotiated. There are, I don't have the numerical data in my fingertips, but there are quite a few Palestinian refugees as defined by UN registries who live outside of the West Bank or Gaza Strip. Generally speaking, their host governments have refused to absorb them as citizens, claiming that while being humanitarian hosts, they believe this is a problem. You know, their citizenship is a matter for someone else to decide. And that position undergirds their expectation that Israel allow a right of return. So what their long-term disposition would have to be worked out if there is a Palestinian state. I would imagine that there would be a high likelihood that many of them would relocate into that Palestinian state if that were the only legal option presented to them, or if it were the best legal option presented to them. There might be an ingathering of Palestinians from other countries in the region and beyond. The Palestinian diaspora is now spread to multiple continents.
Thanks very much. Let's go over to Chris Graves.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that very eloquent explanation of the situation from the beginning till now. I have two questions. The first being, what culpability does Great Britain have for the situation that we're actually in? As they were pretty duplicitous during in running up to Israel claiming itself as a state, but the United States takes all the fury from the Arab countries around Israel, when I really see Great Britain as having a lot of culpability in that. And then also my second question is, Israel's pretty much a secular state. Do you think that as Arab nations, or if Arab nations became more secular, that there would be a greater opportunity to negotiate a two-state solution? And thank you.
Sure, those are great questions. Yes, Britain has culpability for its colonial legacies in Palestine. While issuing it at almost the same time, it issued the Balfour Declaration, which was a promise to the Jewish people that they would have a national home. They didn't promise a state, they promised a national home, although that was promptly interpreted as a state. The British also promised Palestine to the Arabs in the Sykes-Picot Agreement and in the Hussein-McMahon correspondence. They made those promises as wartime emergency expediencies in hope of solidifying the loyalty of the Jewish people and of the Arab people to their anti-Central Powers, anti-Turkish cause during the height of the war. That created a huge mess, because when the war ended and the various parties came in to cash in their IOUs, everyone had expectation that Britain had offered them the same piece of land. Britain did bear the brunt of that legacy for a generation. When it ran the Palestine Mandate, it had to preside over a very difficult situation in which the Jewish and Palestinian communities began to fight each other, sensing that British rule would not last forever. They fought each other for dominant status, and they both fought the British because they wanted the British to leave. And Britain found itself having, taken over a mandate that took on the aspects of a hornet's nest. And when World War II came to an end, even though Britain was an official victor, it was depleted by the war. It began to trim its colonial empire, and it promptly transferred Palestine. The Palestine mess, which it created or contributed to largely, it transferred to the United Nations. From that time forward, the US fairly quickly, over the course of about 2 decades, became the dominant Western power in the region, as Britain continued to decolonize and concentrate its resources elsewhere. So some of the animosity of the modern day, even though it's the fault of the British, if you will, now the US inherited by accepting the mantle of great power authority. On top of the British mistakes, of course, the United States has made a number of mistakes of its own, which have added to some of the backlash among the local people. And remind me, Chris, of your second question.
The fact that Israel is pretty much a secular state.
Right.
And if the Arab nations become more secularized, would that help the negotiations?
There are 2 ways of looking at that. One is the principal question of whether secular states are more or less likely to be in conflict with one another than religious states. And that's a question that historians and political scientists can debate theoretically. More specifically, I think I would have to contest your presumption that Israel is a secular state. While it's true that its leaders have been secular, and that many, if not most of its people identify as secular, religion plays a profound role in Israeli politics. And the secular parties constantly have to make concessions to the religious parties over all sorts of matters, including relevant to this discussion, including control of the West Bank, which religious Israeli Jews call by their biblical names of Judea and Samaria, and which they absolutely refuse to surrender. And that type of religion does incentivize many of the settlers to take up residence on the West Bank. Certainly many West Bank residents, Israeli residents, are secular. They're there because the homes are cheap and they're new and modern and nicely developed, but some of them are there for religious or ideological reasons, and they might be the ones who are more prone to use force to defend their territorial interests there. The Palestinian community, of course, was secular for under Yasser Arafat's early leadership. The PLO was a secular entity, but the first intifada of the late 80s and early 90s did breed religious extremism to a significant degree, and eventually gave birth to organizations like Hamas, which now is a competing power in the Palestinian leadership structure. It's in control of Gaza. The reason why Mahmoud Abbas canceled the elections in 2007 was because Hamas won them. And one of the reasons why he canceled the elections in 2021 was probably because he was afraid that Hamas was going to do pretty well. So the supposition that the two sides are secular or could become secular, I don't think that's a realistic conditional basis to talk about. I think religion is just too powerful in both places.
Thank you, Chris, for those questions. And by the way, folks who have asked a question, if you could go ahead and hit the lower hand button, that'd be good, so we could clear the queue here. Let's go to Troy Fitzhand.
Hi, thank you. I appreciate this talk right now. I have two questions as well. So I see Scott actually just like briefly mentioned it. So given like what occurred in 2005, engagement in Gaza, my first question is why do you think Israelis would have an appetite for quote unquote land for peace when the most recent, and it constantly comes up, the most recent withdrawal end up leading to a situation where there's the rockets that constantly come and Hamas is in power. So why should they have an appetite to give up parts of the West Bank? And the second, which you just touched on in your previous response, demographically looking, the fastest growing population groups from between the river and the sea are both the religious Jews and also the religious Muslims. The religious Jews, many of which are, they see West Bank, or as you said, they refer to Judea and Samaria as, the heartland of the Jewish people and like the Jewish future. So would there really be a situation where they would be interested in giving up the land? And given that those groups are growing, especially on the Israeli side, the religious sector is growing so fast, wouldn't you say that if there's going to be a situation, maybe, I don't know, not anytime soon, but say 20, 30 years, where the religious people will be in the majority to a point where discussions of the two-state solution wouldn't even be at all in the mainstream, because it's not something that they would even consider. They wouldn't consider giving up any single land, because that just runs counter to the entire ideology.
Yeah, let me speak to both of your questions simultaneously in saying that the case for Israel to accept a two-state solution would have to be made despite the historical example that you cited of, beginning to surrender the West Bank only to see Hamas take over part of it, take over Gaza, threaten to take over the whole West Bank. So why would they do that again? The reason they would do it again, and this is a hard sell in the current environment, but the reason would be that the alternatives are worse. The alternative of a one-state solution is something they can't get their heads around because it would compromise their founding purpose of having a Jewish state. If the state became bicultural, it would no longer be a Jewish state. They'd be giving up on the original vision of Zionist ideology that has enamored and excited them for more than that community for more than 100 years. The alternative of not solving the problem, the possible consequences of that right now seem manageable, but they could turn grave suddenly. If there's a third intifada, if there's a weapon of mass destruction used, if there's a wave of terrorism that inflicts horrific costs on the Israeli people, if there's international opprobrium and condemnation that makes it difficult to function in the international environment, none of those factors pertain right now, but they could pertain someday in the future, even in the near future. Israel also had a founding vision of being a progressive and democratic state. David Ben-Gurion challenged the Israeli people, borrowing biblical terminology, to be a light unto the nations, to be enlightened, to be progressive, to be democratic. And the state is all of those things for its Jewish majority, but it is not those things for its Arab minorities, either the citizens or those subjects in the occupied territories. And if Israel wants to remain true to that founding vision, that idealistic vision of a light unto the nations, then it needs to correct this obvious flaw in its political economy. If, on the other hand, to speak counterfactually, Israelis do have the option of making a very different choice. And if they become more religious, maybe they will, because their religion will lead them that way. This is the second part of your question, meaning they could decide just to go for broke and become an empire, to dominate the West Bank, to hold the Palestinian people in subjectivity to some degree of definition for forever, for the foreseeable future, or to ethnically cleanse them, to drive them out of the West Bank and colonize it and settle it entirely with Jewish people. Israel would thereby morph from its original vision of being a light unto the nations to being an empire of a very old-fashioned sort. That's a choice the Israeli people could make. Whether they could get away with it, how the international community would react, whether the Palestinian people would go down without a fight, those are all unanswered questions. But there is what I would consider that kind of very bleak future scenario out there if they elect to go that route. And back to your comment in the second part of your question, religion could prospectively be a factor that drives them in that direction.
Yeah,
Thanks,
if I may
Troy,
just,
Troy, I'm very sorry, but we still have three
yeah.
people in the queue and only about 10 minutes left.
No problem, no problem.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate it. And okay, so let's go to Michael Sarkis.
Hi, professor. Thank you for the talk. I was wondering, do you think that Hamas in any way could serve as like a catalyst of reviving the two-state solution? So I remember hearing or like reading that like Khalid Mashal has a much more moderate stance towards Israel, and that recently with like the whole Taliban negotiation, he kind of commented that he found it strange that the U.S. would negotiate with the Taliban but not with Hamas. So do you think Hamas could anyway serve as a catalyst for reviving the two-state solution? Thank you.
I think Hamas would have to be part of a two-state solution because unless they're brought aboard, they could easily spoil any deal. At first blush, the idea of involving Hamas might seem unthinkable, but if that's the conclusion one would reach, I would remind one that Yasser Arafat was once deemed a completely untrustworthy terrorist. But he went through a transition late in his political career where he emerged as a statesman. He was elected by his people. He addressed the United Nations. He met repeatedly with US presidents at summit meetings. He very much evolved from militant extremist into moderate statesman. So let's not assume that Hamas is incapable of making that type of change as well. They have to, or a two-state solution won't work. They currently have enough power to bring it down.
Thanks very much to both of you. Let's go to Selena.
Yeah, hi. So my question is that given the perspective that Palestinians are unwilling and unable to comply with Israel in a resolution or a two-state solution, how would the Palestinians be even able to comply diplomatically with Israel when their basic human rights are not being met? For example, strict and unnecessary checkpoints, reduced access to water, lack of medical supplies and care, and the land, water, and air siege in Gaza.
The injustices that you've mentioned are injustices that could be remedied through a Palestinian state practicing self-determination and autonomy. So how Palestinians get beyond their current feeling of injustice to statehood would be to think about the prize at the end of the road. That if they can bring themselves to engage in diplomacy with and sign agreements with the hated Israelis, they possibly can gain a state where the injustices of Israeli domination, as they see them and define them and experience them, will be overcome.
Thank you. Let's go to John, and we still have room for a few other questions if people still want to jump in.
Yeah, would you, Peter, would you expand a little bit on what is happening with the Palestinian diaspora? You mentioned it in passing. I'd be curious if there's a change. For example, American rural areas, the best and the brightest are leaving, and you're left behind the sullen and the self-pitying. Is something like that happening with the Palestinians as well? I mean, if I were a Palestinian, I'd want to get the hell out of there. I mean, they talk about a place where there is no future, and I would think a lot of people would be doing that. And so you're left then with the people who are left behind. Does that make any sense?
It does. I don't have data to quote to you, John, but it's my understanding that among the Palestinians who have left, there's a disproportionately high number of more educated, more internationally connected people. Doctors, engineers, teachers are more likely to migrate outside of the area, outside of the immediate vicinity, than the uneducated and unemployed, simply because they have the skills to negotiate the international environment, and they have the skills that make them more attractive to other countries, that need to issue their immigration visas. Whether that Palestinian elite could be tempted to go home, so to speak, and join a new Palestinian state is an open question. The return of some of them, I would think, would be a net gain for such a Palestinian state, because they would bring their experience and their education and their leadership back to make a difference.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Let's go to Colin Jones.
Colin, I think you're muted.
Colin, you're muted. Try it one more time. I'm sorry, Colin, we still can't hear you. Could you type your question in? You can't hear him either, Peter, right?
I cannot hear him.
Yeah, Colin, go ahead and type your question in. I'm gonna ask a quick question, and then we'll come back to you as the last question. All right. Well, hopefully, Colin will jump in with his question in the chat. So, Peter, I'll ask a question, and then we'll hopefully go back to Colin. So, I'm interested in what. Oh, actually, we do have one. Let's go to Sandy. Sandy just popped into the chat.
Yeah, sorry about that. I wasn't able to, I don't know why I can't find the little hand thing. Normally I can. When I look at history, I think from the bottom up, and I'm wondering how much buy-in and how much attempt has been made to even speak to the Palestinians, ordinary Palestinians on the ground. Where do they come in? I mean, BDS is, BDS laws are rife here in the United States. In Ohio, we're not allowed to really be part of that. The Palestinians are talking about apartheid, comparing their situation with apartheid. And so Abbas does not necessarily represent everybody, neither does, the Hamas. So how much are the Palestinians, I'm hearing about everybody else, but the ordinary Palestinians on the ground who are really the ones suffering more than anybody in this whole conversation.
I think there are avenues for communicating with ordinary Palestinians and for ordinary Palestinians to express what we call a public opinion. There are, Western scholars who do surveys, opinion surveys of the Palestinian community. There are Palestinian universities and newspapers where expressions of opinion and observations are made. And I think in the in-depth negotiations that are conducted by, say, the U.S. State Department, there is an effort made to discern and ruminate on Palestinian opinion, because that opinion does set boundaries around what Palestinian leaders can try to do or can accomplish. It's probably true that in American media, there is not adequate coverage or comparable coverage of Palestinian opinion, whether of elites or of common people. But the internet enables one to look more deeply than the American media that's broadcast conveniently. And I think you can find places like Al Jazeera and elsewhere where the Palestinian perspective, whatever that means, but the Palestinian perspective is displayed.
Thank you. I'm gonna. Oh, sorry, Peter. Go ahead.
I'm sorry. Just one other afterthought, and it ought to be researched because Sandy, your question is spot on. It is an important part of the equation.
Peter, we have about 3 minutes left, so I'm going to jump in with one last question. So, as you teach Middle Eastern history, I'm curious if you could let the audience know and let me know what are some texts that you think are particularly illuminating and reliable, not just history texts, but novels, memoirs, films, etc., that can help people get a sense of its conflict and its history.
Well, that's a great question. And you're turning the tables on me. That's usually a question I ask of graduate students rather than the other way around. There are so many that where would be a great place to start? The journalism of Thomas Friedman, I think, is a good place to gain insights. Films I don't know well. I have seen some documentaries on the occupied territories and on the peace process that are recommendable, although I'm really bad at remembering the names of films. In the major literature, there is so much, I don't know where to begin. There's a whole body of literature on each era of the Arab-Israeli conflict. I mean, as a historian, I know the past literature more than I know the theoretical, political science, international relations literature of the current situation. But if you're interested in a particular historical era or a particular historical episode, then there are some really good books about each of those. Memoirs are always a great place to begin. Memoirs can often provide insights of key breakthroughs in a way that is hard to tell from the other primary sources, but of course they often don't stand the test of time or the scrutiny that can be applied once other primary sources are made available. Jimmy Carter has interesting books about the Middle East, both during his presidency and post-presidency periods. And the other major players through Reagan and Clinton have recorded their own perceptions, their own experiences in dealing with the Middle East. And words that are insightful for getting inside of their minds, for understanding what factors beyond the rational cases that their policymakers recorded in official papers, what irrational or impulsive or ideological factors might have played in their mind that help them filter the reasoned arguments of their assistants and advisors.
Thank you very much. So thanks, everyone. We are right at 5 o'clock right now, so we're gonna have to wrap up for the day. Thank you all for attending. Thank you very much, Peter, for leading our discussion today. Before everyone takes off, I just want to remind you that we have our next event. The journalist Wes Morgan is discussing his new book, which is called The Hardest Place, the American Military Adrift in the Afghanistan's Pech Valley. That's going to be held virtually on October 7th from 3:30 to 5. You can register on the Mershon website for that, and we hope to see you there. Thank you again, everyone, for attending today.